America didn't want these records. The labels shelved them. The radio stations ignored them. The charts never found them. But in the early morning hours at the Wigan Casino in Lancashire, where thousands of teenagers danced until dawn on wooden floors polished by their own movement, a different kind of justice was being served. These songs played at 3 in the morning to people who had traveled hundreds of miles specifically to hear them. Tonight, 12 soul queens who came from the world of Hitsville USA and became royalty in the north of England. Number 12. The Velvelettes. The Velvelettes are one of the clearest examples of a specific kind of tragedy that the Motown story contains. A group talented enough to produce genuine classics, signed to the most powerful soul label in the world, and then systematically ignored by that label's promotional machine because the attention was going somewhere else. They came from Kalamazoo and Battle Creek, Michigan, several of them college students at Western Michigan University when they were signed to Motown's VIP subsidiary in the early 1960s. Needle in a Haystack gave them a genuine chart entry in 1964, hitting number 45 on the Hot 100. The label's attention moved on. These Things Will Keep Me Loving You, released in 1966, is a piece of textbook perfect Motown production. Hand claps locked to a drum pattern that doesn't move, a melody that rises and falls with the specific emotional architecture that the Holland-Dozier-Holland era had refined to a science, vocal harmonies that land exactly where they're needed. In America, it barely registered. The group couldn't get radio support. The label wasn't pushing them. The Supremes were happening. The Velvelettes were not. In Britain, the Northern Soul scene found These Things Will Keep Me Loving You and heard exactly what it was, one of the finest recordings to come out of Detroit in the mid-1960s. It became a Wigan Casino staple, one of the records that the best DJs kept in rotation because the dance floor response was immediate and consistent. Every time it played, people moved. The Velvelettes dispersed in the late 1960s. Several members returned to education and family life, the practical necessity that Motown's failure to properly develop them had made unavoidable. In England, their music never stopped. Number 11. Kim Weston. Kim Weston arrived at Motown in 1963 as the kind of talent that should have been a major commercial star, a voice of genuine power and range, capable of delivering both intimate ballads and upbeat soul material with equal authority. Berry Gordy signed her as a solo artist and also paired her with Marvin Gaye for duets, a partnership that produced several significant recordings before Tammy Terrell's name was introduced into the equation. Take Me in Your Arms, Rock Me a Little While was written by the Motown team of Edward Holland, Lamont Dozier, and Brian Holland, the writers and producers responsible for most of the label's commercial peak. Released in 1965, the song reached number 4 on the R&B chart and number 50 on the Hot 100. For most Motown acts, that would be a satisfying commercial entry. For a voice of Weston's caliber, it represented only the beginning of what should have been possible. Weston left Motown in 1967 after a contract dispute, frustrated with the limited promotional support the label was allocating to her recordings relative to the attention Diana Ross and the Supremes were commanding. She signed with MGM and continued recording without recapturing the chart positions of her Motown period. In Britain, Take Me in Your Arms, Rock Me a Little While became a Northern Soul standard, The kind of record that DJs could always count on to maintain a floor, because the combination of Weston's voice and the HDH production produced something with an energy that translated immediately to dancing. Working-class teenagers in Lancashire who had never heard Kim Weston's name found her record and made it theirs. The commercial system that had failed her in America couldn't touch what the Northern soul scene did in her honor. Number 10. Brenda Holloway. The story of Brenda Holloway and the Northern soul scene is one of the most complete stories of artistic vindication in this entire series. She had recorded Every Little Bit Hurts at 18, given Motown its first major West Coast hit, co-written You've Made Me So Very Happy, and walked away from the label at 22 after writing Berry Gordy a letter asking for a real commitment to her career. He didn't respond. She stopped recording. She had no idea what was happening in England. This loneliness you've given me. Through the early 1970s, Northern soul DJs were discovering and playing her Motown recordings. Not just Every Little Bit Hurts, but the deeper catalog, the album tracks and B-sides that American radio had never touched. I can't go on giving my life. You've Made Me So Very Happy, the song she co-wrote with her sister and with Berry Gordy, the song that Blood, Sweat and Tears turned into a massive pop hit in 1969, was a Northern soul staple. Every little bit hurts. When I'm gone, just look what you've done. Operator, the Wigan Casino and the Blackpool Mecca were playing her recordings to crowds who had no idea that the singer herself was living in relative obscurity in California, largely outside the music industry she had helped to build. Northern soul eventually reached Holloway directly. Northern soul collectors and promoters sought her out and told her what had been happening to her music in England while she was away. The revelation that her recordings had been finding devoted audiences in the north of England for years, while she had assumed her career was over, contributed to her return to performing in the 1990s. My love is strong for you. I do. Brenda Holloway eventually toured the UK's Northern Soul circuit to audiences who loved her recordings deeply. Darling, you'll see, the letter that Berry Gordy didn't answer in 1967 was answered in the most unexpected possible way by the people of Wigan and Lancashire. Number 9. Lorraine Chandler. What do you do when you cross your own? Lorraine Chandler was born and raised in Detroit. She was part of the same musical ecosystem that produced Motown, coming up through the same churches, the same clubs, the same network of musicians, producers, and talent scouts that made Detroit the most important city in American soul music during the 1960s. She didn't record for Motown, she recorded for RCA, one of the major label's subsidiaries, but she was a product of the same world, shaped by the same sounds, connected to the same infrastructure. What Can I Do? I Have Nothing, recorded in Detroit in 1967 and produced by Don Davis, is one of the most devastatingly effective soul recordings of its era. Chandler's voice carries the specific quality that distinguished the best Detroit soul from every other regional sound, a control that never tips into mere technical display, an emotional directness that reaches the listener before the conscious mind has time to process it. The song is about loss, and Chandler sounds like she knows exactly what loss feels like from the inside. In America, the record went nowhere. RCA didn't promote it. The commercial moment passed. Chandler continued working in Detroit's music scene without the breakthrough her talent warranted. You can't have a In the UK, Northern Soul DJs found What Can I Do? I Have Nothing, and recognized immediately that this was exactly the kind of record the scene existed to champion, a genuinely great piece of American soul music that the commercial system had failed to deliver to the audiences it deserved. The Wigan Casino played it. The response confirmed what the DJs had heard. Lorraine Chandler died on January 2, 2020, in Detroit, largely without the recognition that the quality of her recordings justified. She was beloved in the north of England in a way that America never quite matched. Number 8, Bessie Banks. Before the Moody Blues made Go Now a British hit in 1964, before they took it to number 1 on the UK singles chart in January 1965, Bessie Banks had recorded the original version for Tiger Records in New York and watched it barely register commercially in the United States. Banks was a gospel-trained singer from New York who had been working in the soul and R&B world in the early 1960s, recording for small independent labels without the commercial infrastructure that might have translated her genuine vocal ability into sustained commercial success. When she recorded Go Now, written by Larry Banks, her husband, and Milton Bennett, the song had an urgency and a desperation in her vocal delivery that the Moody Blues later acknowledged as the template for their recording. The Moody Blues heard Bessie Banks' version through the British soul and R&B scene that was hungry for exactly this kind of American material in 1964, the same hunger that was simultaneously driving the Northern soul scene's formation. They covered it, added the specific sonic texture of British R&B, and took it to number 1. Banks' original remained largely obscure in America. Northern Soul's relationship with Go Now is specifically with Banks' original recording, the version that had the rawness and the gospel-rooted vocal commitment that the Northern scene prized above all else. Darling, 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 I'm still in love. Working-class British kids in the north of England were listening to Bessie Banks, while the rest of Britain was listening to the Moody Blues. Just how many times I have to tell you, darling, darling, darling. The woman whose recording inspired the cover version that went to number 1 never had a number 1 hit of her own. Her voice has outlasted the specific commercial moment that ignored it. If you're locked into this one, most people scrolling past these songs have no idea what it took to make them. We digs that history back up, one record at a time. The subscribe button costs nothing, and it means you won't miss the next one. Number 7, Judy Street. The Northern Soul origin story of What begins with a singer named Melinda Marks, the daughter of Groucho Marx, who recorded the song in 1965 for a small label without significant distribution. Judy Street then recorded her own version in 1966 for Strider Records, and the Street version became the one that the Northern Soul scene found and made into one of the most played records in the history of Wigan Casino. What was the B-side of Street's single, You Turn Me On? The A-side was the planned commercial vehicle. The B-side was the recording that survived. The song has a specific quality that explains its Northern Soul appeal perfectly. The tempo is fast but precise. The production has the clarity that allows every element to be felt through a PA system in a crowded room. And Street's vocal delivery combines a brightness with an undercurrent of desperation that hit exactly the emotional register Northern Soul dancers were there to feel. It is a record that makes you want to move before you've consciously decided to. Far Out magazine's list of the 100 greatest Northern Soul songs of all time cites What as a particularly unexpected track, which took hold of the folks at Wigan Casino during the 1970s.
Don't stay away.
The B-side to an A-side nobody remembers is now one of the defining records of an entire cultural movement.
Do you want me to call you on the phone, beg you to come?
Judy Street recorded it at some point in the mid-1960s and then largely receded from public musical life. In Lancashire, her voice never stopped playing.
What can I do when I still love you?
Number 6. Barbara McNair.
So you think you got my man?
Barbara McNair was one of the most multi-talented artists on the Motown roster. A singer, an actress, a television host, a Las Vegas performer who moved between the entertainment industry's different registers with a facility that most performers can only manage in one at a time.
Don't you know that he'll come running back?
She had her own television variety show, The Barbara McNair Show, which ran in syndication from 1969 to 1971. She appeared in films including If He Hollers, Let Him Go and Change of Habit, alongside Elvis Presley. She was, by any conventional measure, a successful entertainment industry career. And yet her recordings for Motown, her specific soul recordings from the mid-1960s, the ones that showed what her voice could do without the television polish, were among the most under-recognized productions the label ever released. You Could Never Love Him Like I Do, recorded for Motown's subsidiary Motown label in 1966, is a declaration of territorial conviction, a woman telling another woman in direct, unambiguous terms that the man they're both interested in will never get from one what he's already receiving from the other. The production has the Motown hallmarks: the rhythm guitar pattern, the horn punctuations, the female backing vocals arriving at exactly the right structural moments. And McNair's vocal delivery brings to it the kind of lived authority that her stage experience had given her. Northern soul DJs found You Could Never Love Him Like I Do and understood immediately what it was: a Motown quality production that the label's promotional machine had moved past without properly championing. British teenagers who had never seen Barbara McNair's television show or her films knew her voice from the dance floor of the Wigan Casino. Number 5. The Flirtations. The Flirtations occupy a unique position in the Northern Soul canon because they were, in the most literal possible sense, a transatlantic act. Three sisters from Linden, New Jersey, Viola, Shirley, and Ernestine Pierce, who moved to the United Kingdom in the mid-1960s and spent the better part of a decade building a following on the British soul and pop circuit, recording for the British Duram label rather than an American company. Nothing But a Heartache, released in 1969, is the recording that defines the Flirtations in the Northern Soul context, a cascading, piano-driven production with the three sisters' voices weaving through and around each other in a way that creates the specific impression of multiple perspectives on a single emotional experience. The song is about romantic disappointment, and the Flirtations perform it with the kind of harmonically dense conviction that makes romantic disappointment sound like one of the most sophisticated emotional experiences available to a human being. In the United States, the Flirtations were almost entirely unknown. Their American origin, combined with their UK recording output, created a commercial blind spot in both directions: too British for American radio, too American in sound for the British pop mainstream at the height of the rock era. The Northern Soul scene recognized Nothing But a Heartache as exactly what it was: a genuinely excellent soul record that the commercial system had failed to place in front of the right audiences. The Wigan Casino and the Blackpool Mecca gave it the audience it had always deserved. Three sisters from New Jersey who had crossed the Atlantic in search of an audience found their most devoted one in the most unexpected place, the all-nighter circuit of Northern England. Number 4. Ann Peebles. Ann Peebles wrote, "I Can't Stand the Rain" in 15 minutes. She has said this in interviews. She was sitting in a hotel room, it was raining outside, and the sound of raindrops on the window gave her the melodic and rhythmic idea that the entire record is built around. She co-wrote it with Don Bryant and Bernie Miller, called the studio, and recorded it almost immediately at High Records in Memphis, with Willie Mitchell producing. The core sonic element, a specific dripping sound that perfectly mimics rain, was created using a modified Optigan, a consumer keyboard instrument that Willie Mitchell's brother had adapted specifically for this purpose. They built the record around an Optigan sample. That specific sound became one of the most immediately recognizable sonic signatures in the history of soul music. Ann Peebles is not a Motown artist. She recorded for High Records in Memphis, working within a different but equally significant strand of Southern soul production. But her connection to the Northern soul story is direct and documented. "I Can't Stand the Rain" became a Northern soul standard, played at the Wigan Casino and the Blackpool Mecca and every subsequent Northern soul venue, with a consistency that reflected the record's power on a dance floor. The song has also been sampled or interpolated in over 100 recordings across 5 decades by artists from Missy Elliott, who used its distinctive rhythm in Rain, Supa Dupa Fly, to Supertramp. The B-side that reached number 6 R&B on its original 1973 release is now one of the most influential recordings in the history of the genre. Northern England found it first. Number 3. Tobi Legend. Tobi Legend is one of the most extraordinary figures in the entire Northern soul story, not because of commercial success or mainstream recognition, but because of the specific, almost cult-like devotion that a single recording has generated in the north of England across 5 decades. She was born Bessie Grace Gupton in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, and grew up in the specific cultural and musical overlap between Canadian gospel and Detroit soul that the geographic proximity of Windsor and Detroit created. Windsor sits directly across the Detroit River from Detroit, close enough that radio signals from Hitsville USA's era were part of the sonic landscape of Tobi Legend's childhood. She absorbed the Detroit soul sound with a specific intimacy that comes from physical proximity. Time Will Pass You By, recorded in 1969 and initially released as a single on a small label, is a recording that defies the conventional categories of commercial soul production. It is slower than most Northern soul tracks. The genre generally prizes up-tempo energy above all else, but it possesses something that overrides the tempo consideration, an emotional completeness, a sense that every element of the recording is exactly where it belongs, that makes it impossible to walk away from once it has started playing. Last.fm describes Time Will Pass You By as considered one of the best Northern tunes ever. The Northern soul community has placed it consistently near the top of any ranking of the greatest recordings in the scene's history. And yet, Tobi Legend's name remains almost entirely unknown outside that community. A woman from Windsor, Ontario, sitting across the river from Detroit, made a recording in 1969 that is still considered one of the greatest Northern Soul records ever made. The music industry of 1969 had no idea what it had. Number 2. Doris Troy. Doris Troy wrote Just One Look herself. That fact is worth stating clearly, because in the history of R&B and soul music, female artists writing their own commercial material in the early 1960s was neither common nor consistently acknowledged. Doris Elaine Higginson, born in New York in 1937, raised in the church, with a voice trained on gospel before she ever entered a recording studio, walked into Atlantic Records in 1963 and gave them a song she had written, and it became one of the most significant debut recordings of the decade. Just One Look hit number 10 on the Billboard Hot 100, a genuine pop crossover for a debut single. It was, by any commercial measure, the beginning of something significant. Troy followed it with What You Gonna Do About It, the same song later covered by the Small Faces and turned into a British hit. She worked as a background vocalist for artists ranging from the Beatles, she sang on the Let It Be sessions, to Pink Floyd, to George Harrison, who produced her 1970 Apple Records album in London. But Doris Troy's American commercial career never fully recovered the momentum of Just One Look. Atlantic didn't know what to do with her. Label situations shifted. The sustained commercial development that her talent warranted never materialized in the United States. In the UK, the Northern Soul scene found her recordings and recognized what American radio had failed to properly honor. Her voice, the specific warmth and attack of someone who had grown up singing gospel in New York City, was exactly what the all-nighter circuit of Northern England needed in the small hours of a Sunday morning. They played her records until the floors shook. Number 1. Gloria Jones. NPR has called Gloria Jones the Queen of Northern Soul. That title did not come easily or quickly. It came from one of the most extraordinary second life stories in the history of popular music. A story that begins with a flop, moves through an accidental discovery in an American record shop, passes through the sweating floors of the Wigan Casino, and eventually arrives at Soft Cell's studio in 1981 to produce one of the biggest selling singles in UK chart history. Gloria Jones recorded Tainted Love in 1964. It was the B-side of her single, My Bad Boy's Comin' Home, on the Champion label. Songwriter Ed Cobb had written it. Glenn Campbell played lead guitar on the session. The song barely registered commercially. It didn't chart in either the US or the UK. The label that released it, Champion, distributed through VJ, was not a commercial powerhouse. The record disappeared. Jones went on to build a career as a Motown songwriter. She wrote, If I Were Your Woman, for Gladys Knight and the Pips, one of the label's most elegant early 1970s recordings. She worked in musical theater, performing in the cast of Hair. In the early 1970s, she became a keyboardist and vocalist for Mark Bolan's glam rock band T-Rex. She and Bolan entered a relationship and had a son together. Tainted Love was in the past. Then, in 1973, a British DJ named Richard Searling was in the United States, digging through record shops and crates for Northern Soul material to bring back to England. He found a copy of Tainted Love and heard immediately what the Northern scene would hear in it: an urgent, pounding rhythm, a female voice pushing against the beat with the specific physicality that the Wigan Casino dance floor demanded, and a melodic hook that locked into the memory on first hearing. Searling played it at Vava's in Bolton and then at the Wigan Casino. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Tainted Love became one of the casino's defining records, the record that the crowd clapped along to on live recordings, the record that people traveled specifically to hear. It was played at every all-nighter, with the kind of frequency that only the most beloved records received. Gloria Jones came to Wigan to perform it live. Mark Bolan told her what was happening to the song in England. He was plugged into British music culture in a way she wasn't, and he recognized the significance of what the Northern Soul scene was doing with a recording she had largely forgotten. She was astonished. She re-recorded Tainted Love in 1976 for a single produced by Bolan. The new version didn't chart either, but the original remained untouchable at the casino. Then, Mark Bolan died in a car crash in September 1977, the same car crash that left Jones injured and grieving. The specific intersection of her personal tragedy and the ongoing Northern Soul championing of her recording gave the story of Tainted Love a weight that went beyond music. Mark Almond of Soft Cell, who described first hearing Tainted Love through the Northern Soul scene, recorded his duo's cover version in 1981. It became the best-selling single in the United Kingdom that year. Soft Cell's version has been covered more than 100 times since. NME ranked the song at number 305 on their 500 Greatest Songs of All Time list in 2014. The woman who recorded the original in 1964 as a B-side that nobody heard is the Queen of Northern Soul. The North of England decided that before anyone else did.